Hello, everyone. We are delighted that you are joining us today for our webinar, Navigating CIRO Exam Priorities and Focus Areas. A couple of housekeeping items to go over with you all. We are recording the call today, and we will be sharing this recording afterwards. So no need to scribble notes. If you missed something, you can watch the replay. And then we also welcome you all to engage and ask questions in the chat. I will be monitoring those questions, and we've allotted some time, about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the discussion, to go over them. Also, as many of you, I'm sure, are similarly working from home, there may be some background noise, and we appreciate your patience with that. And then I wanted to take a moment to introduce InvestorCom. If you are new to InvestorCom, we are a leading regulatory software provider for wealth managers across North America. Our award-winning solutions are intuitive solutions that help eliminate compliance risk and foster growth for our clients. Next, we are going to introduce our stellar lineup of panelists. They each have incredible accolades and experience, and I'm actually going to have each panelist introduce themselves, starting with you, Nancy, and then we can just go across these photos here.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me. My name is Nancy Mehrad, for those who don't know me. I'm the CEO and founder of Registrant Law, and we are a law firm here in Toronto providing regulatory compliance and securities law services to dealers, portfolio managers, and investment fund managers. And a lot of my days actually nowadays consists of helping registrants comply with the client-focused reforms and any of the recent regulatory guidances that we've received about it. So I look forward to our discussion today.
Thank you again. Yes, I'm very happy to be here. My name is Chris Somerville, a litigation partner at Affleck Green McMurtry. We're a litigation boutique firm, and one of my main areas of expertise is representing and advising investment dealers and investment firms and representatives.
All right, thanks, Chris. Birju Shah, I'm the Chief Compliance Officer for Canadian Investment Financial, which is the MFD business for CWB Financial Group. And primary area of responsibilities, distribution and oversight of retail mutual funds.
Thanks, Birju. And this is Randy Barnes, Director of our Product Development, Sales Engineering here at InvestorCom. My main responsibilities are really working with folks like we have here today to understand what you need, where we're going, what's going on in the industry, and hopefully help provide solutions to get us there.
Thanks, Randy. Hi, everyone. Param Nasseri. I'll be moderating today's conversation and looking forward to what new perspectives people are going to bring to the table.
Thank you all. My name is Grace Bryan. I am the Marketing Director at InvestorCom, and I'm your MC today, not one of the panelists, but I will be walking through our agenda and the pre-webinar survey. So today we'll go over, thank you all of you who participated in the pre-webinar survey. I'll go over those results. We will have a high-level discussion on CIRO's 2024 compliance priorities, and then we'll dive into the different key components from range of reasonable alternatives, risk capacity and risk tolerance, and then the dealer's KYP obligations. And again, as I mentioned before, we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes at the end to go over any questions that you may have. Diving into the pre-webinar poll, we have this poll in order to direct our conversation during the webinar, inform the topics that we hone in on and discuss, and also to see where you all are at. And we captured some interesting results. So we began by asking, how prepared is your firm for CIRO's Phase 2 client-focused reform sweep? Only 8% of respondents, the blue here, the dark blue, feel confidently very prepared. And then the majority of respondents feel somewhat prepared or very prepared at an aggregate of 67%. Perhaps you're coming to this webinar to glean insights, tips, and tactics to help increase that confidence level even further, and we're excited to provide you with that. The second question is, what is your top concern regarding preparing for CIRO's Phase 2 CFR sweep? So the majority, 59%, responded that understanding the focus areas is a top concern, followed by training staff and advisors at 25% in the green. So the good news is that we're going to go over the focus areas. This is a core reason why we are here today, and our esteemed panelists will be able to provide some insights here to alleviate this concern. And then after the webinar, we'll be sharing out an implementation guide that will help you prepare for the sweep at the firm level and also at an advisor level, which should help alleviate the second top concern here. So stick around to be able to receive that. And then the last question how do you rate the role of technology in achieving compliance with CIRO's key focus areas? To which an aggregate of 83% of respondents said that this was extremely or somewhat important, and that was great to see as well. So I will now pass the baton to Param to lead out in our conversation today.
All right. Thank you, Grace. Hopefully folks found some insight in the data, and let's jump in. So what we know is there's been multiple phases of the client-focused reforms journey. Specifically, there are 2 phases of implementation and 2 phases of, obviously, regulatory exams. And we got here when CIRO published their CFR, CIRO published their Phase 2 priority exams. And Nancy, maybe I can start the conversation by asking you to talk a little bit more about what you see in that process.
Yeah, I mean, I think just going back to basics, I mean, the CFR implementation dates, as we know, were June 30th of 2021 for the COI components, and then the rest of the CFRs, the deadline was the end of December of 2021. Since then, there's really been two phases, 2 sweeps, I would call them. So the first phase was over the client, the conflicts of interest components of the CFRs. And that resulted in 2 publications, well, the major one being the CSA and CIRO guidance that was published in August of last year, which provided a very detailed and lengthy description of their findings and additional guidance for the industry on the regulatory expectation of how to implement the COI component of the client-focused reforms. If you haven't already done so, I would highly recommend that you review that guidance and conduct a self-assessment against your own policies, procedures, and disclosures to see if there is room for improvement. And I say this even more so because in the CIRO report that was published, CIRO did remind members that they will continue to review the conflict of interest component of the CFRs in their examination. So just because they've moved on to Phase 2 doesn't mean that they won't be considering or examining the COI component. So it's really important to make sure that you have reviewed those that guidance and you feel comfortable with where you are. In addition to that joint notice, there was also, I always find this helpful, there was a BCSC compliance report that was issued in May of last year. And that was also helpful because it gave a different angle of the types of findings that they had in terms of the COIs. So the second phase, which has already started, is more focused on the KYC, the KYP, and the suitability components of the CFRs. And so, of course, once the regulators complete that sweep, then we'll have, hopefully we'll have some guidance to see, where the industry stands in terms of how they are implementing the reforms and whether that is in line with regulatory expectations.
Wow, Nancy, thank you. You covered probably 4 years of regulatory guidance in a few minutes. Birju, you have to, you're the practitioner on the call here. You have to implement these specific policies, and they're principles based. Perhaps you can walk us through how you're going to embrace the first and the second phase of the CIRO exams.
Sure, Parm. So I think it's important to sort of always approach this to your point as principles based, and so there is a level of framework, but it's up to individual dealers to sort of chart their path forward in terms of how they are going to achieve compliance with client focused ones. And the first exam is always the most nerve-wracking, if you will, for all compliance folks, because that's sort of the barometer that you're going to look back on. You have these principles, but until you have a check front to back, side to side, you're really on pins and needles to see what you did. Was that going to be sufficient, or what areas would you need to improve upon? So from that standpoint, our compliance team always welcomes any sort of a test or an audit of the function that's put into place. And the experience was largely quite positive. What was interesting to see over the discourse with CIRO at that time was how it wasn't just us in that space, and how a lot of dealers were sort of facing similar challenges and similar experiences with implementation, largely around the third-party product shelf and being able to effectively monitor the shelf and be able to provide reasonable alternatives. And that was, to a degree, also reassuring to know that we were not the only ones in that situation. But industry trends as a whole, and this has been highlighted as what Nancy was mentioning earlier in most recently in the compliance priorities for 2024 from CIRO, that client-focused performance phase 2 findings continue to be still top of mind, as expected to a degree. A lot of the firms are going through their first test post CFR launch, and their findings are very much along the same way.
Amazing insight. Thank you for sharing that candidly, Birju. And there's a couple of threads that I want to kind of pick on. Maybe Chris, I can point the question your way. So what Nancy shared was that there was quite a few findings in the first phase of the exams. If I remember a data point, it was that 78% had some potential issues centered around conflicts of interest, and now the second phase of the exams are beginning. And so, as someone who helps firms through litigation, how was your experience, or let me say it this way, what do you expect to see if a firm's exams findings are escalated to potentially enforcement?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Parham, because in our area of expertise in litigation, we do both civil litigation and enforcement litigation. And so that covers the entire enforcement process, representing and giving advice in the investigation stage as well as the hearing stage. So what I expect to see is the firm whose findings are escalated to enforcement, they're going to be paying more to get to the same point as other firms who didn't get escalated to enforcement. CIRO wants to see what firms have been doing to set up processes and policies for implementing CFR Phase 2. The firms with the biggest risk of seeing enforcement are those that did the least implementation. CIRO will probably use the enforcement phase to force those firms to make the changes they should have been making already at potentially greater costs, including the risk of getting fined in addition to making the changes. So it's better for the firms to make that compliance investment now to catch up with their peers, because if they don't, they'll probably end up having to pay more for it later.
Sound counsel from Chris Somerville. Really appreciate it. Now, Randy, one of the advantages we have as a software provider or service provider in this industry is that we see different practices across the industry. And curious to see what you're hearing as you're helping these firms and our client base with respect to these specific compliance requirements.
Yeah, it's interesting. You've got a couple of them listed there in some of the bullets, but we're hearing a lot of angst around the when do you need to do this, which I think as a bit of a spoiler alert, it might come up later on in this webinar, maybe. Another one is just, which is an age-old problem, and it surprises me that it keeps coming back around, is this whole notion of how you document what you're going through, and thinking about it from the perspective of both your field, your financial professionals, as well as how this is going to affect you guys on the supervision and compliance side, and finding that right sweet spot where you can be efficient, thorough, and reduce the level of archaeology and interpretation that needs to go on with a bunch of handwritten notes and forms. And then the third thing I think we've been hearing more recently is just that reminder that the account type that you could be recommending is also part of that range of alternatives. And so, if you're looking at from a managed versus non-managed perspective, making sure that you've got a way to hit that rationale as well.
Love it. Love it. You've dropped some nuggets into what we're going to be segueing into. And really at the crux of it, it starts with this new set of requirements that were doubled down in the exam priorities by CIRO. And the requirement to consider range of reasonable alternatives as part of the enhanced suitability requirements. Nancy, let's start with the requirement to do so, and what's the true purpose behind this requirement?
Yeah, so this is part of the suitability requirement, so which requires that as an advisor, when you make a recommendation to a client, you have to determine that the action is suitable for your client based on a number of factors, one of which is a reasonable range of alternative actions that are available to you through your firm at the time that the determination is made. So to give you an example, if an advisor is about to make a recommendation that his client invest in shares of Apple, and his firm also has Microsoft on their shelf of available products, then before that advisor makes the recommendation, they should consider whether Microsoft might be a better option for the client. It's very important, and having seen some clients going through these exams, it's very important that the advisor document that he considered Microsoft and his reasons for deciding to recommend Apple instead, and that's in that instance, or vice versa, whichever way they decided to go. And also you have to, of course, put the client's interest first. And so that means when you're making the decision, you can't be influenced by, for example, the fact that one security pays a better commission than another. So that's really the gist of, in a high level, the gist of the requirement.
Love it. I sometimes pause just to be able to find the damn mute button, but thank you for so skillfully answering that question, Nancy. This comes up a lot. This set of requirements is somewhat consistent across the new Canadian requirements, as well as what's going down in the U.S. market, and the true value of comparing alternatives at the time of the recommendation. Randy, you talked about this from, the need to do that when an account's being opened. When a product's being recommended is what Nancy's product or security is what Nancy's referring to. What are you seeing across the industry?
Well, that there's no, a lot of folks are still struggling with the when and therefore the how. And I think what we can try to advocate for is don't reinvent existing processes because you're trying to fit this into something you're already doing today, right? Because if this truly does need to be done at multiple points, multiple times in the journey, you don't want to tie an existing cumbersome process to other areas of your flow. Like, for example, we're hearing a lot of folks are tying certain chunks of this to new account opening, which is great until you have an instance where you need to trigger this type of review and it's not part of a new account flow, right? And so now you're really starting to back into things or bastardize certain things to just try to make stuff fit. So, I would advocate for a simpler modular type of an approach that you can then plug into any area that you need to do this stuff. That's kind of the way we counsel our the folks that we talk to, and hearing, you know, kind of the feedback from the prospects and everything that we're talking to. This has got to be simple, right? You don't want to take the long way around the block to get to some of this, because it's going to affect adoption. It's going to affect your efficacy. Like, it's just going to have such a ripple effect.
Birju, pointing the question to you. So Randy's shared what we are seeing across the industry. What are you seeing amongst your industry peers?
I think Randy touched on a very interesting point, which is not reinventing the wheel. From an advisor experience perspective, it's also important to recognize that how do you make additional requirements fit a process? Client-facing teams are very process-driven, and there is a set process with KYC reviews or recommendations in terms of how they've been going about it. This was a significant change. The number one question I received from our client-facing teams, and this is something that I spoke to a couple of colleagues in the industry on, was how do we approach this from the perspective of it not being additional work, but incorporating it as a value add to my clients, a reasonable range of alternatives discussion. How do I position this recommendation to my clients, not solely from a product perspective, but showing the value of me as an advisor to indicate, this is what I've done for you, client, and these are the recommendations that these are the options that we looked at, and here's my recommendation because A, B, C, whether it's cost, risk, return. What are you basing your recommendation on, and how does it compare against its peers in terms of said factors, whether it's cost, risk, or return? And that's something that is key from a compliance standpoint to observe, as you don't want compliance requirements to sort of be a hindrance or a roadblock at any point in time in the client experience. You want it to be married to the advisor process, almost to the point of having to do compliance without realizing you're doing compliance. If you can achieve that, I know it's sometimes feels like a utopian ask, but if you can achieve that, it makes the advisor's job a lot easier too.
Principle-based regulation and a utopian ask can never be said in the same sentence, Birju. Thank you for sharing that. I love this, and I think we're seeing all the questions percolate up on this particular topic. So maybe I can go a little bit off the cuff and throw some pointers in here. Randy talked about performing this sort of consideration or assessment at the time of the recommendation. I want to double click on the timing component of this, and then also Randy talked about account type recommendations, sort of the managed account versus non-managed, discretionary versus non-discretionary. And there's a couple of nuggets I want to just quickly interject into the conversation. On the account type piece, it's really interesting. I think that might be a bit of a surprise to folks, because naturally you think, hey, a recommendation equates to a product recommendation. But I'd sort of point to the specific companion policy that reviews the range of reasonable alternatives, and in there is mention of account types also fitting into the recommendation piece, and it specifically applying. So that's a key component. And then maybe actually I'll pause on that. Nancy, any thoughts? Are any of your clients hitting on that particular question?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think that's absolutely right? Like, if you have the ability to, if you offer two different types of both a managed account and a discretion and a non-managed account or an advisory account, then absolutely that's one of the components you should be considering. I think a lot of my clients are really more focused on the security type, though. It's more about, okay, it's a suitability analysis for recommendations. That's what I've been seeing more of. Just, how do I establish record keeping, for example, of the fact that my IAs have actually considered a reasonable range of alternatives or securities? Or how do I how do I make sure that that the scope of products is right? And so those are really more the types of questions that I'm seeing, Pat.
That's super helpful. Maybe we could talk about point number 3 here, which is the timing of the assessment. One of the things that we've observed, team, is that there are some generally, I want to say, different practices across the board. That shouldn't be a surprise to many, given how far we've been talking about this, around the timing of the assessment of reasonable range of alternatives, which isn't necessarily it's RRA, so I can't really give it an acronym. The timing piece is key. We've seen firms who've elected to go with policies that say, look, you're going to do this once a year. And then if you read the regs, there is specific mention of the fact that this needs to be done at the time of the recommendation. Any thoughts across our panelists around what is generally acceptable practice?
I mean, I'll jump in. I think it is at the time of the recommendation. Is what the regulation requires, and that to me makes sense, because if you're about to make a recommendation in a client's account, then that's the point at which you would be reviewing what other options are available to you. So that to me makes most sense.
Yeah, I tend to concur with Nancy on that. It's the time of the recommendation. However, as a value add, going back to incorporating this into the advisory process, it's also important to demonstrate value at the time of reviews. Now, it might be more of a best practice at that point. Obviously, the spirit of the expectation in this case is at the time of recommendation. The word time of recommendation, it's interesting, because a lot of times if you're transferring assets in kind from another institution, are you treating that as a recommendation to transfer an assets in kind? One can discuss semantics on it for a while, but I think as an advisor, I think comes back to the value of the advice, right? And recommendation is a key piece of said advice. So I'd say from that perspective, definitely a best practice to look at it as an advice-focused conversation.
Really, really good points. Thank you, Nancy and Birju. And now, Chris, I keep pointing the baton or the mic at you, it's sort of looking at it from a reverse perspective. If a firm has not complied with the spirit of the requirements, what steps can they take to mitigate their exposure?
I think the short answer is that they should be attending presentations like this. The firm needs to learn what other firms are doing to comply and what options are available to achieve compliance. So if they speak to other firms, if they speak to their peers, they'll get a sense of what types of compliance solutions are available for meeting their requirements. So they need to go out there, make sure they're looking for best practices. They need to document that they've done that, show that they've done surveys, that they've spoken to people, or that they've identified different options. And so once they've identified their options, they need to weigh the options based on their own business model, their own requirements, and then make a decision on what makes the most sense for the firm in terms of an implementation strategy. And then when the decision is made, they need to support that decision with a documented analysis of why that was the right decision for the firm. So while it can be intimidating, you have a new set of requirements to meet here. And if you feel like you haven't achieved it yet, or a firm feels like it still has work to do, don't let that be intimidating. Just go through the process of doing your best to identify what the best solution for you is, and explain what you've done and why you've decided that that's the best for you.
You've said that so clearly, and I just hope it's being covered consistently across the industry and adhered to. So let me, I see that we're sort of a little bit behind on time. Let me just expedite the conversation a little bit. Let's fast forward to the risk tolerance or the product due diligence questions. Let me just, I think I'm skipping the risk capacity pieces. Let's talk about those quickly. Nancy, let's start with touching on what's new here, which is risk capacity, and perhaps touching on how your clients have implemented that specific requirement or that specific change.
Right. Yeah. So the CFRs introduced the requirement to collect as part of the KYC process a client's risk profile, which is the new term, which essentially means your client's willingness to accept risk, which is risk tolerance, which has always been there, and the client's ability to endure financial loss, which is risk capacity, and that's the new component. And so risk profile should always be the lower of the client's risk tolerance and their risk capacity. So what I've seen is, some firms have established questionnaires to collect risk capacity information. So while the CFRs don't say you have to have questionnaires, I think they certainly do help. You create an objective and consistent approach to collecting the data points. They're also a great tool to facilitate that meaningful discussion that you're supposed to have with your clients during the KYC collection process. It's honestly, it's a great way to have that, just to open up the conversation, especially with your newer clients, just to engage in more discussion with them. And of course, you have to have detailed notes of your discussions with your clients. And the more details, the better, because, if you're subject to a civil lawsuit or a regulatory investigation, where the allegations made that the client's risk profile, for instance, is different from the advisor claims it is, then at least you've got really good notes for the courts to review. Some firms, of course, I know you have different client sets. It really depends on your business model. And some with, say, just permitted clients or institutional clients, some of the more sophisticated clients, they will prefer not to use a questionnaire. But in that case, then really the note taking should be even more detailed at that point, illustrating why the risk tolerance and the risk capacity is what the advisor indicates it is, and that you've illustrated that you've had a meaningful discussion with the client. So what I mean by that, it's not enough to just say risk profile medium. That's not going to cut it. I think you're going to have to explain with sufficient detail to prove to a regulator or to a court to evidence why it is that the risk profile is in fact a medium. If you're not using the questionnaire, or even if you are, I also recommend that you provide some sort of checklist to ensure that the advisor is collecting that risk profile information based on the relevant KYC factors. So the financial circumstances of the client, the liquidity needs, the debts, etc., so that you can better document that you've done that assessment and that you're going through an objective process. And my last tidbit would be that you also conduct regular testing and provide training to your advisors to make sure that they are going through an objective approach and collecting the risk profiles appropriately.
All right. So whoever hasn't embraced the risk capacity question, please focus in on what Nancy just said. And Chris, maybe I can kind of do the reverse sort of type of the framing of the conversation with you again. And I've worked on the regulatory side of the fence and know that how important this risk profile, risk capacity question is in a lot of the potential litigations or investor complaints that come downstream. What do you see coming out of these set of new requirements?
So I'll add my perspective, but before I do that, I want to just say how helpful I thought what Nancy said was. The suggestions that she provided were excellent, and I hope everyone listening was taking careful note of those. Very helpful to consider as ideas for complying with this. From my perspective, considering how this might play into a litigation scenario, I like to try and look at it from a positive angle, and my view is seeing risk capacity as something of an objective check on risk tolerance. Because in litigation between dealers and clients, it's been common for clients to dispute the risk tolerance identified in their KYC documents after the fact. So it's written down a certain way, and then the investment doesn't go right, there's a dispute, and then there's oh, that wasn't really my risk tolerance, that was totally wrong. So historically, it's been difficult for dealers to answer this issue of risk tolerance being wrong because the client gets the last word on what their own risk tolerance was. But risk capacity can be evaluated independently of what the client says, based on verifiable information about their financial circumstances. So put another way, it's easier for a dealer in a litigation scenario to prove a higher risk capacity than a higher risk tolerance. So what I suggest firms do is lean into this new requirement, embrace the concept of risk capacity, and develop systems internally for demonstrating that they've considered it in a systematic fashion. And to that, again, I echo what Nancy's comments were. They were excellent.
Amazing. I think this has been helpful for most. I know I've learned a ton so far. On the risk capacity, risk tolerance piece, Birju, how have you tackled this complex set of requirements?
I think there was a very key word that Chris used, and I want to sort of take a minute to go through that, which is evaluation, and it's truly that. It's how do you evaluate, given the circumstances? It is a subjective evaluation. How does an advisor evaluate their capacity? In our business lines, we have taken a variety of approaches. We have looked at questionnaire, and we have looked at notes, depending on the business line and the complexity of it. That's what's been the driving factor for us, and again, worked hand in hand as a part of our examination findings with CIRO to determine which the best course of action would be. Of course, for a more sophisticated client, it might be more valuable to have a guided sort of evaluation between them and the advisor based on a conversation, versus for a retail client, it might be more valuable to approach it from a black and white, more objective perspective of what capacity is. But at the end, again, it comes back to the word evaluation. It's truly an evaluation, and documenting how that evaluation is made.
Wonderful, wonderful. This is super helpful, and thank you all for your insights on this. Maybe we can then jump into the product due diligence and KYP section, seeing that we're at the sort of the 137 mark. Nancy, can we start by looking at the dealer's KYP obligation and the requirement to assess the product shelf? What are some practical steps for firms that tackle this wide-ranging implication of the requirements?
Yeah, I think, just going back to basics, you have to have, as a firm, an established and documented process for assessing and approving securities on your product shelf. The key here is that it has to be documented, and you should be explaining that in your procedures document as well. So, of course, the extent of the assessment that you do on the securities, so your firm's process, depends really on the security. So if you've got a very complex or security, then you may have a more rigorous process for that type of security versus a less complex one, or a public security, for example. So if you're going to do that, you have to make sure, of course, that your firm's procedures and do actually set out the different levels of assessment, the approval, and the monitoring for the different types of securities as appropriate. So CIRO's due diligence process, or KYP, requires firms to review various different elements of securities as part of that process, such as the security structure, its risk, its costs. So what I always advise clients is that, to ensure that you're reviewing all of these aspects, it's helpful, again, and I'm a key proponent of templates, but it's helpful to have some sort of review template so that your IAs, or if you've delegated it to them, or whoever's doing the approval process, is making sure that they're going through all of those elements as they conduct their assessment and they document their assessment. The reason I advise my clients to do this is that if you are subject to a regulatory examination, you can provide evidence that you've actually satisfied the various factors required to meet the KYP obligation. In 2021, IROC, as it was then known, issued its product due diligence and KYP guidance. That provided a very helpful list of key considerations for the dealer member firms on the line today. The key considerations that you should be looking at when conducting a product due diligence. So I would recommend that clients do take a look at that if you haven't already done so. Just so that you make sure that you're covering off the areas that you should be in your documentation and in your assessments and approvals. Another thing I've seen that's helpful is to have committees or authorized groups with, especially if you can have senior staff on there. They're helpful in helping you also document the assessment and the approval of the securities on your shelf. You should also have minutes and keep any slides that you have so that you can present them if you're asked for them. You should also determine the level of post-approval follow-up that's required, such as whether you need to give additional training for a particular type of security, or whether you need to monitor any restrictions that are applied to a security. So those would be my high-level thoughts.
Hey, lots of work to do for folks who, given our poll responses, felt like they were not prepared. There's plenty of work ahead. Maybe we can talk a little bit more, Nancy, about sort of that whole proprietary shelf question that's come up. It's specifically outlined in the companion policy. How can firms assess the competitive nature of their products from a framework perspective if they do have those proprietary products available?
Yeah, so if we're talking about proprietary products, I think, as we know, there's guidance in the CP that states that where a firm only trades or recommends proprietary products, then you should be conducting a periodic due diligence on comparable non-proprietary products and whether that product is in fact competitive with alternatives in the market. There are various approaches to conducting this assessment, and I think it really depends on your business model and the type of securities that are on your shelf. I've seen some firm using technologies to help with this assessment. I'm sure Randy or my other colleagues on this panel will be able to speak to those technologies, but there's that option for those that would allow the advisors to choose from the universe of securities. They may also have assigned a registered individual for carrying out that assessment. So it really depends on the business model that you have.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing your insights, Nancy. Birju, can we bring this to a practical level, and can you share how your firm, you have looked at tackling the set of dealer level KYP obligations?
Absolutely. In terms of dealer level requirements, we started having this conversation sometime, let's say, early 2020. And the consensus was we have, in a lot of circumstances, multiple versions of a similar product that were on our shelf at that time, pre CFR. And then from that point onwards, the conversation evolved into, are we comfortable with the number of products, and then how to achieve a balance between ensuring that clients are given the choice and the variety of product, and the advisors have access to enough of a shelf that they can provide a reasonable recommendation, but at the same time, it not be overwhelming. And what it did lead us into, we had third-party products, and we continue to offer third-party products on our shelf. But it was, what was pretty evident was the fact that there is going to be an expectation going forward that if you're going to keep a product on the shelf, that you be able to not only document why that product remained on the shelf long term, but also stay current on a regular basis whenever there is a significant change to the product, and assess if said significant change is going to impact any client positions that are being held with that product. So in our specific circumstance, we did end up reducing our product shelf significantly pre-phase 2 going live. And since then, what we have found is that the conversation has become more advice-centric for advisors in terms of understanding what is the client-specific situation and be able to provide a recommendation based on that, versus in the past, there was an expectation that if there are factors surrounding a particular transaction, i.e., let's say if it's a non-registered asset that is being transferred in kind and there's tax implications, there was hesitancy previously, pre-CFR, for advisors to indicate, I'd rather not deal with the tax implications of liquidating a position and transferring in kind and deal with it at a later date. Whereas now, with the requirement of evidence, KYP on the security being transferred in, advisors have taken a bit more of a proactive approach in terms of determining not only was this investment the right fit for you when you invested in it, but does it continue to be the right fit going forward? Because it is an additional complexity that they need to keep in mind going forward.
I couldn't agree with you more, and I'm sure, Randy, you've got plenty to say on this. Now that we've got our sleeves rolled up, I think this question of significant change is something that obviously we want to talk about a little bit more. Give me a second. My slides appear to have been frozen. Let me just try one more thing here. Yeah, they're not moving. Are they moving for you all? No? All right. No good webinar without some computer glitch. Maybe I can ask you to speak high level around what you've been seeing across that set of requirements of capturing significant change and how it trickles down into advisors' book of business and the underlying clients who those advisors are serving.
Yeah, I think the key word there is significant, right? And defining what that is. And typically that definition is going to be different from dealer to dealer, I would suspect. So making sure that there's a way to indicate for your firm what you feel is significant. And I think actually there's probably going to be a difference in what's significant for the dealer to monitor at the product analyst investment level versus what's then trickling down to the advisor, right? And so just making sure that you've got a framework that, similar to what you've got depicted here, Parm, where you can distill down the tens of thousands of changes across the universe, across your shelf, and filter it down and get to something that's meaningful. Typically what we're seeing or hearing is when it gets down to that advisor level, making sure that you can bounce maybe a half a dozen or so significant data points, and if one of those changes, then be able to relate that to the advisor's book or their position file to make sure that they're notified when one or more of their customers holds a position there, and they can then spring in, and it becomes actionable, right? It's not just data, it's not just content, it becomes actionable for them to be able to move forward with.
Oh yeah, this question has actually come up quite a bit in our travels, because you go back to first principles and the firm's obligation to be a gatekeeper and the requirement to assess and manage that sort of product offering. That's the first pillar. And the second pillar after that really is what happens if those security types change. The simple one I think we talked about earlier that sort of segues the conversation through is, let's just say, risk level of a product. If it changes, right? How can everybody involved in that process, from the firm down to the advisor, down to the investor and their portfolio, how can they all be aware of when a potential risk rating changes? And risk rating is one data point. There are several. There are cost data points. There are time horizon changes that happen all the time. So this process, or having a process for this specific component of the requirements, is ultimately key, in my opinion.
Yeah, and take one more example just to illustrate one of the other points, which is, let's say, for example, fund manager. Maybe the analysts at the top of the house want to know when a fund manager changes, but that might not be something that you want to pass along to that advisor level, as they're going through their filter. So again, kind of being able to make sure that you have the ability to delineate that effectively is going to be important.
Wonderful. You might hear some sirens in the background. I'm just downtown Toronto. It's a normal thing. No one's chasing me. Let's use the sirens as a good inflection point to jump into our Q&A segment of the presentation. And there's been plenty of questions that have come in. Having said that, certainly welcome more questions as we go through this. There are some questions. Maybe I'll start with Linda's question, and that talks about balancing, I believe, sort of priorities and especially for smaller firms as they're looking at the set of requirements. How can firms actually balance the compliance requirements with staying competitive in the industry? Any insights there?
Well, I would say, this might sound self-interested, but hire external help if you're not able to, if you don't have the resources to do so yourself, because quite frankly, if you're not compliant and you don't have a license, then you're not going to be very competitive. So I think it's really key to be compliant with these regulations. Having said that, it's also helpful when you do have, I think one of my co-panelists mentioned this, when you are talking to your peers, you can get a better sense of what the industry standard is, like what other colleagues are doing. And that will help you decide whether the approach you've got, whether you're more of an outlier or whether you're more in line with what others are doing. I think that's also helpful.
Thank you, Nancy. Maybe in the interest of time, I'll sort of jump into some other questions that have been asked. We get this question all the time. There is no right answer, but I'll, for the sake of being transparent, I'll ask it anyways. When it comes to the reasonable range of alternatives, what is the correct number of reasonable range of alternatives that would be recommended for a fund? Anybody want to take a guess at this?
I think the question goes beyond that to a degree, Parham, in the sense that what is your product shelf? I would ask that question. Is your product shelf broad enough to accommodate a reasonable range of alternatives? And if the answer is no, then that brings into question, do you need to go beyond the product shelf available just to your advisors to assess reasonableness? Because it's the concept of reasonableness is just that it is a subjective measure, and how you determine it goes a long way in terms of being able to support your position of whether you examine enough.
I do have to share with everyone. We don't have it on the slides in the presentation today, but when we looked at our clients' data for a 2-year time period, who were using our products to compare reasonable alternatives, we observed that over that 2-year period, the quality of those recommendations measured across cost, risk, and return, which is something you talked about, Birju, was actually improving over time. So it's sort of that age-old example of you go to Best Buy, Future Shop, whatever, to buy a flat screen, and suddenly, or even Amazon, right? And all your product alternatives are right at the bottom for you. Quite quickly, you can make an evaluation or assessment of, all right, should I be buying the most expensive flat screen that's available to me, or should I consider alternatives? And so that exercise in and of itself, in my opinion, having worked across Canada and the US, there is value there. There is insight that improves the outcome for the investors. And that's certainly something that can be teased out through this CFR phase 2 exam findings. Chris, let me sort of point the question to you from a litigation perspective. The term reasonable is something that probably has been dabbled on across multiple forums. Let's just say if a firm has a process for evaluating up to 5 reasonable alternatives, would there be any potential risk for somebody to come in and say, hey, you should have evaluated 10, not 5?
There's always the risk of that happening. The only real way of providing reassurance is to say, have I developed a rationale to support the number 5 that I'm prepared to stand by and defend? That's what the firm, that's the way I think the firm should consider this. And I mean, the overall objective here is to ensure that the client's getting a fair choice between different options. And the specific number isn't really as important as the concept that the client is truly getting a real choice between similar but significantly different options, and has a way of deciding what the best one is based on the advice of the advisor. And so if the regulator approaches the firm and says, why did you justify, why did you pick a set of 5 options? Why didn't you consider more? You can say, well, no, these are the best 5 options that we could come up with based on this framework. This is how we decided to pick 5. And we decided not to include more for the following reasons. Potentially a reason is because too many options would overwhelm the investor based on the circumstances of this relationship. The number 5 was the best way of communicating the options to this particular type of client, and other reasons. But as long as the reasons are recorded, documented, and the firm is prepared to stand by and explain its decision, then it's putting itself in the best position.
That's really helpful, Chris. And quite honestly, across the various clients we've been serving across Canada and the US, so long as you have a process that's repeatable and consistent across the advisor workforce, that's pretty damn defendable. No one's actually been able to kind of pick a flaw with that. And that's effectively the starting point, in my opinion. I think once you have that buttoned down, then the examination risks are for sure mitigated. I see no other questions coming in. I want to maybe just quickly welcome any final questions from our audience. If not, thank you everyone for participating in this webinar, and a sincere thank you to our wonderful panelists. Grace, maybe I can pass it to you.
Absolutely. So if you attended the webinar today, you will receive a downloadable version of our CFR Phase 2 range of reasonable alternatives and KYP guide. This content will help you prepare for and implement all of these incredible insights from this webinar, and also contains some easy to follow priority frameworks. So be on the lookout for this. This will land in your email inbox along with the replay of this webinar. And again, we so appreciate you all for joining us today. Thank you so much to our incredible panelists for sharing their expertise, and we will see you all soon.